Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Jeff with Bear of a Blogger, and you are listening to another Bear of a Blogger podcast. Today we are going to talk about bird photography, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about photographing hummingbirds and what shutter speed you should be using to photograph hummingbirds and to try and stop the wing motion. Hummingbirds have incredibly fast wing beats, and sometimes it's hard to freeze the wings in a photograph um, to kind of get that nice crisp look of a hummingbird just kind of hanging there in midair. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to freeze the wing motion and what shutter speed you need to use to do that. I wrote an article on my website about this a couple of years ago. So if you guys want to check that out with a little bit more in-depth information, you can go down to the description below and click on the link that'll take you to my website that talks about this very subject. We're going to just briefly hit the highlights about photographing hummingbirds and what shutter speed you need to be using. Now, all of this really depends on how much light you have available when photographing hummingbirds, because you need to have your shutter speed running basically as fast as you possibly can with whatever light you have going on at the time. Now, when I say a fast shutter speed, the bare minimum that I recommend is 1/2500th of a second, preferably faster if you can get it with whatever light and whatever settings you can change on your camera to get that light in. I prefer to shoot hummingbird photographs with 1/4000th of a second if I can get it, and even if you can get it faster, that's even better. The other day, I was watching a video on a guy who was photographing hummingbirds, and he shot some images that were 1/8000th of a second. I've never shot them that fast, but I've even had images at 1/4000th of a second that there was still even a little bit of blur on the wings, because their wings are incredibly fast. So the basic rule of thumb is the faster the shutter speed, the better when photographing hummingbirds. I think the bare minimum is 1/2500th of a second, and I've had some really good images come out at that speed, but I've had some of them that were actually still blurry. I've shot a lot of them. I've photographed a lot of images at 1/4000th of a second, and a lot of them do turn out pretty good. So basically, it comes down to the faster the shutter speed you can get, the better chances are you have it slowing or capturing the image, freezing the wings in the image. Now, to do that, you've got a couple options. If you're photographing on a bright sunny day, it's a little bit easier. But if you're photographing on a cloudy day or early morning, late evening, you have less available light from the sun. So you got to change a few things. You can do a couple of things. Now, when I photograph hummingbirds, I'm always using what my camera says. I shoot in Canon, so it's called aperture value. Basically, I get to change the aperture, and the camera will set the shutter speed accordingly. You can go the other option and use time value, which means you set the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. But I like to do it the other way around, and probably one of the few photographers that do it this way. But I like to set the aperture to where it's as wide open as it possibly can, which means you have a small f-stop number. The reason I do that is because I specifically want to blur as much as I possibly can behind the hummingbird, and that's one of the ways you do that is you have a wide open aperture. And by setting your aperture wide and you set your ISO at a fixed number, it actually forces the camera to run as fast as it can. So you can kind of affect the shutter speed that way. And by doing that, I've been able to get shutter speeds as fast as 1/4000th of a second, especially on clear days and on sunny days. So on the other days where it's a little not, you don't have as much light, you can kick the ISO up on your camera. But I generally don't like to shoot over one or shoot over 800 ISO. I've done as high as 1600 with pretty good results with the grain that you get, or not the grain, but the noise that you get in the image. So I prefer to shoot 800 ISO or less when at all possible, just because you get a little bit more noise, especially on cheaper cameras. It just adds a little bit of that noise into your image. So if you can help it, stay at 800 ISO and less, and then open your aperture as wide as you possibly can. And if you can, try to photograph in full sun because you need as much light as you possibly can to get your camera to run as fast as it can with according to shutter speed. So it's all about the light, as much light as you can get to make your camera run as fast as possible. Some days it's not as easy as others because you may be overcast, or you may be photographing where there's some shadows and stuff, or you have a dark background. But the rule of thumb is try to photograph with as much light as you can so you can run your shutter speed as fast as you can, preferably at 1/4000th of a second if you can get it there. That's the basic rundown of what shutter speed you should be using for photographing hummingbirds. The faster, the better is just a general rule of thumb. So I hope that helps. We're going to do a lot more of these photo tips on our podcast here. So feel free to follow this channel, and you can actually follow us at bearverblogger.com, where we're going to do some actually blog articles on the topics. And we also do a lot of other things about photographing birds and just bird watching in general, nature in general. So feel free to follow us at bearverblogger.com as well. And we will catch you on the next podcast.